You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Let's talk about the Battle of Fort Washington, a significant event during the American Revolution that took place in New York on November 16, 1776. The British forces, led by Lieutenant General William Howe, claimed a major victory against the Americans, capturing the remnants of the garrison at Fort Washington, located at the northern tip of Manhattan. This battle was considered one of the most crushing defeats for the American patriots in the war. Previously, the British had beaten General George Washington's troops at the Battle of White Plains, and Howe set his sights on taking Fort Washington, which was Manhattan's last defensive position held by the Americans. Though General Washington gave General Nathanael Greene the option to evacuate the fort and move the 1,200 strong, later growing to 3,000, garrison to New Jersey, Colonel Robert Magaw, who was in charge at the fort, decided to stay and fight, confident in his men's ability to fend off the British. However, the battle did not go as Magaw hoped. On that November day, before General Washington could even check in on the fort, Howe launched an attack from 3 directions: north, east, and south. The Americans' defenses on the south and west collapsed quickly, even though the high tide in the Harlem River caused some delay for the British. The American troops to the north put up a tough fight against the Hessians, soldiers from the German state of Hesse, but they were eventually overwhelmed. Surrounded on all sides, Colonel Magaw was left with no choice but to surrender the fort. The loss was heavy for the Patriots. 59 Americans were killed, and a staggering 2,837 were captured as prisoners of war. Following this battle, a large part of General Washington's army was chased across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, the British tightened their grip on New York Harbor and the eastern part of New Jersey. During the American Revolutionary War, there was a pivotal stronghold called Fort Washington. It stood on Manhattan Island's highest point, where a massive chunk of rock known as Manhattan schist juts out near the tip. Directly across the river, on the New Jersey side, perched atop the cliffs known as the Palisades, stood its sister fort, Fort Lee. Together, these forts guarded the lower stretch of the Hudson River, shielding it from the British Navy's reach. In June of 1776, a group of American leaders, including Henry Knox, Nathanael Greene, William Heath, and Israel Putnam, scouted out the land for this new fort. They concluded that, with proper reinforcement, Fort Washington would be virtually unassailable. George Washington, who led all Continental Army forces, later inspected the spot himself and recognized its strategic importance in defending the river below. Soon after his inspection, troops from Pennsylvania began work, led by Rufus Putnam. Their first task was to block British ships from sailing up the river. They transported large rocks from Manhattan's high points to the water's edge. There, they assembled the rocks into structures that spanned the river, effectively creating a barrier against enemy ships. After establishing the blockade, they focused on constructing the fort. Building the fort was challenging. The rocky terrain lacked the typical layer of soil. Soldiers had to transport soil from lower areas because they couldn't dig the usual defensive trenches. The fort was designed in a pentagonal shape, with each corner reinforced by bastions. The walls consisted of earthen mounds, designed to enable cannon fire in all directions. The fortification covered 3 to 4 acres of land, with the perimeter defended by a barrier of sharpened logs known as an abattis. By September, the barracks were completed, and all troops in the area fell under the command of Major General William Heath. Washington also established his command post nearby to maintain close surveillance. Around Fort Washington, additional fortifications were established. These included gun batteries at Jeffrey's Hook extending into the Hudson River, Cox's Hill with a vantage point over the nearby creek, strategic positions to the north over the Harlem River, and along Laurel Hill to the east. To the south, 3 layers of trenches and foxholes formed an additional defensive buffer, with each line strategically placed to create successive barriers that the British would have to breach. In late August of 1776, after taking over western Long Island in the Battle of Long Island, British General William Howe moved on to attack Manhattan on September 15th. However, his advance was stopped on September 16th at the Battle of Harlem Heights. Howe then tried to get around the strong American defenses to the north. Following a failed attempt to land his troops on October 11th, he began moving troops into southern Westchester County, in what's now the Bronx, on October 18th. His plan was to block the American army from retreating. Aware of the danger, General George Washington pulled most of his forces back to White Plains, but left 1,200 men under Colonel Robert Magaw at Fort Washington. Later, it became clear that this number wasn't enough for proper defense. Meanwhile, Howe had left Hugh Percy and a small force near Harlem Heights to keep an eye on the American garrison. On the morning of October 27th, Percy's soldiers moved to attack, backed by 2 frigates on the Hudson River. Magaw had his men fire at the frigates, heavily damaging both as the ships couldn't aim their guns high enough to hit the American positions. The British eventually had to tow the frigates away, but an artillery battle went on for a while between the two sides. Then on November 8th, a small group of Americans, about 24 soldiers, managed to chase away a slightly larger group of Hessians, German mercenaries fighting for the British, from a forward position. Despite the Hessians having the high ground and artillery support, they couldn't keep their ground. The Americans suffered only 1 wounded soldier, while the Hessians lost at least 2 men killed and others wounded. After destroying anything temporary at the site, the Americans held it until nightfall when they went back to their main lines. The next day, the Hessians came back but were once again driven off by a larger American force, leaving 10 of their men dead while the Americans again had just 1 wounded. Because of these victories, Magaw grew too confident, even claiming he could keep the fort under siege until the end of December. But on November 2nd, Magaw's aide, William Demont, betrayed them by defecting to the British and giving them detailed plans of the fort. Percy passed this information to Howe, who had recently beaten Washington at the Battle of White Plains. As weeks passed and Washington retreated further north, more reinforcements came to the fort, bringing its numbers up to nearly 3,000 men. George Washington was initially leaning towards giving up on Fort Washington, but Nathaniel Greene persuaded him that the fort was worth defending. He thought that keeping the fort could maintain communication across the river and perhaps even stop the British from going after New Jersey. Both Colonel Magaw and General Putnam agreed with him, so Washington decided to stick with the plan to hold on to the fort. On November 4th, General William Howe led his troops towards Dobbs Ferry. He chose not to chase the American forces in the Highlands, likely influenced by secrets he got when Lieutenant Colonel James Pattinson Demont switched sides. Instead, Howe was set on attacking Fort Washington. Washington reacted by splitting his army into 3 parts. 7,000 troops stayed east of the Hudson River under General Charles Lee to protect against a potential British move into New England. 3,000 men with General William Heath watched over the Hudson Highlands to keep the British from moving north, and Washington himself took 2,000 men over to Fort Lee. By November 13th, Washington and his men had arrived at Fort Lee. Howe had a strategy to capture the fort by coming at it from 3 different sides, while a 4th group faked an attack. In the meantime, the fort had been reinforced and was defended by 3,000 men. Hessian commander Wilhelm von Kniphausen would strike from the north, General Hugh Percy would head a group of Hessians and British battalions from the south, and Lord Charles Cornwallis, along with the 33rd Regiment of Foot, and General Edward Matthew with light infantry would hit from the east. The 42nd Highlanders were the 4th group, assigned to pretend to land on the east side of Manhattan below the fort. Howe wanted to avoid a battle, so on November 15th, he sent Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson with a flag of truce, delivering a stark ultimatum: surrender the fort or face death for everyone inside. Colonel Robert Magaw answered defiantly, saying that the Patriots would fight to defend the fort to the last extremity. In the early hours of November 16th, British and Hessian forces sprang into action. Led by Kniphausen, his troops crossed the Harlem River using flatboats and set foot on Manhattan Island. Meanwhile, the tide prevented a seamless crossing for Matthew's unit, causing a delay in the joint advance. As dawn broke around 7 in the morning, Hessian artillery zeroed in on an American battery perched on Laurel Hill, and the British frigate Pearl rained shots onto American defences. Further south, Percy commanded his artillery to target Fort Washington, taking aim at the very cannons that had previously wreaked havoc on British ships. By the time noon arrived, Kniphausen's forces resumed their march. High tide allowed Matthew's men, escorted by Howe, to make the river crossing under intense American artillery fire. Unfazed, the British charged, pushing back the American forces until they encountered sturdy resistance from Pennsylvania volunteers. The fight was short-lived. The Americans quickly retreated towards the fort. To the north, Hessian commander Johann Rall and his troops faced little opposition as they climbed the hills south of Spuytenduivel Creek. Meanwhile, Kniphausen led a force of 4,000 through challenging terrain towards Fort Washington. Amidst trees and rocky ground, they confronted 250 sharpshooters of the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Moses Rawlings. The riflemen, nimble and sheltered by natural cover, repelled the first 2 Hessian assaults. At that time, John Corbin manned a cannon atop a ridge, known today as Bennett Park. A Hessian assault claimed his life, but his wife, Margaret Corbin, bravely took his place at the cannon, She continued to fight valiantly until she was gravely wounded, thereby earning the distinction of being the first known female combatant of the American Revolution. Simultaneously, to the south, Percy pressed forward with approximately 3,000 men, halting briefly before initiating an orchestrated feint by Stirling. Across from Percy, Alexander Graydon prepared to defend, under the command of Lambert Cadwallader, Magaw's deputy, responsible for the defence south of the fort. Cadwallader hastily redirected troops to counter an unexpected British landing, facing Stirling's lightly opposed forces. Stirling, commanding the 42nd Foot, seized the opportunity to scale the heights and scatter the Americans. As the sound of battle reached Percy, he ordered his men to press on. British artillery drove Graydon from his position, forcing a retreat to a secondary line protected by Washington, Greene, Putnam, and Hugh Mercer, all of whom promptly evacuated to Fort Lee. Realizing Cadwallader was in a precarious position, Magaw instructed him to fall back to the fort. However, both Cadwallader and the retreating troops were aggressively pursued by Percy's contingent. Caught between the British forces, some Americans bravely fought Stirling's men, delaying them just enough to enable most American soldiers to narrowly escape capture or worse. As the American forces faced overwhelming odds, General Magaw's troops were forced to fall back to the relative safety of Fort Washington. The southern defenses had never been fully established, leaving Cadwallader and his men with no option but to retreat to the fort. In the north, Rawlings and his riflemen, who were now outnumbered and dealing with weapons jamming due to excessive firing, resorted to rolling boulders down the hill at the attacking Hessians. The American artillery at the fort was neutralized by the enemy, led by someone named Pearl. As the rifle fire dwindled, the Hessians slowly advanced, ultimately engaging the Americans in brutal close-quarters combat. They overpowered the defenders and, with a bayonet charge, quickly captured the position. From across the river, General Washington closely observed the dire situation. He sent a note to Magaw, urging him to maintain their position until dusk, hoping they could escape under the cover of darkness. Meanwhile, the Hessians had seized the land between the fort and the Hudson River, cutting off any potential escape route. Johann Rall was honored with the task of demanding the American surrender on behalf of Knyphausen. Rall dispatched Captain Hohenstein, who was fluent in English and French, under a flag of truce to negotiate the surrender. When Hohenstein met with Cadwallader, the Americans asked for a 4-hour deliberation period. Hohenstein refused, granting them only 30 minutes to make their decision. While Magaw and his officers weighed their options, Washington's messenger, Captain John Gooch, managed to reach them with Washington's plea to hold out. But it was too late. The fort was nearly encircled. Magaw tried to secure better terms for his men, hoping they could at least keep their possessions, but this was unsuccessful. By 3:00 p.m., Magaw made the difficult decision to surrender. An hour later, the American flag was lowered and the British flag was raised in its place. In a final act of daring escape, John Gooch jumped from the fort walls, survived the perilous fall, dodged gunfire and bayonets, and made it to a boat, reaching Fort Lee shortly after. When the Hessians took control of the fort, the colonists attempted to win over Captain von Malmberg, who was overseeing the surrender. They welcomed him into their quarters and treated him to punch, wine, and cake, coupled with their best wishes. Despite these gestures, the Hessians were severe, taking the Americans' belongings and physically assaulting some of them, prompting the American leaders to intervene to stop further harm or potential fatalities. The British took a substantial amount from this victory: 34 cannons, 2 howitzers, in addition to a considerable number of tents, blankets, tools, and ammunition. It was a significant triumph for the British, marking one of the most substantial losses for the American side during the war. The British and Hessians reported 84 lives lost and 374 wounded, while the American toll was 59 killed, 96 wounded, and 2,837 captured. The conditions for prisoners at that time were so severe that of all those captured, only 800 survived after spending 18 months as prisoners, later exchanged. That's an astonishing 3/4 who did not survive their captivity. Then, just a few days after Fort Washington fell, the Americans abandoned Fort Lee as well. General Washington led his forces on a retreat across New Jersey, reaching the Delaware River and eventually arriving in Pennsylvania, with the British pursuing them as far as New Brunswick in New Jersey. In about a month, Washington executed a bold maneuver. On the night of December 25th and 26th in 1776, he crossed the Delaware River and unexpectedly attacked the Hessians in Trenton, with Rall in command. Following that victory, Washington also defeated the British at Princeton, significantly lifting the morale of the American soldiers and the others disheartened by the loss of Fort Washington. 7 years later, on November 25, 1783, with the war concluded and the peace treaty in effect. General Washington and Governor George Clinton triumphantly re-entered Fort Washington. This moment of victory marked their progression toward Lower Manhattan, coinciding with the departure of the last British troops from New York. Today, if you are in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, you can visit Bennett Park, which is located on the exact site where Fort Washington once stood, near the George Washington Bridge. Within the park, the outline of the old fort's walls is delineated with stones, and there is a plaque commemorating its significance in history. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.